The nutrients of disruption. Observations from a season of storms and weeds. When we moved into the new farm, we inherited centuries of lawns, pathways, and fields that had been tended, mowed, and cultivated by all the people who came before us. The grass around the farmhouse rolled out like an old painting, the shrubs orderly and shaped. I'd never lived anywhere that had been maintained for generations, and I felt a bound duty to keep up the good work. My intention was to keep the orderly lawn mowed and edged. As we moved into winter, I had time to work on a plan. I'd teach myself the ways of keeping a good lawn, and I would source better equipment and supplies. I consulted with lawn pros and researched every decision. As soon as the first weeds appeared in the spring, I planned to start mowing. If that didn't keep the interlopers in check, the next step would be to use herbicides in the fields to choke out the invaders and encourage more grass growth. By March, spring arrived earlier than expected, throwing me off track. The ground breathed new life faster than I could make time to mow. I watched the dirt closely each day, puzzling over which shoots were sprouting and trying to identify them by their leaves. I decided to wait a bit on the mowing so I could figure out what was growing in this new to us farm. At first, it was just a scattering of unfamiliar leaves pushing up through the soil. The horses noticed them long before I did. For weeks, they had been cropping the wild spring onions scattered across the pastures, confirmed by their breath that smelled like an Italian restaurant at closing time. Then other spring plants began to emerge. Henbit, chickweed, grape hyacinth, hairy bittercress, blue violet, dandelion, field pansy, shepherd's purse, and sow thistle. As the days passed and the plants finally revealed their blooms, I began identifying them one by one, and what I discovered surprised me. Nearly every plant was not only edible to humans, but nutrient-dense and packed with minerals and vitamins that are needed at the end of winter, when bodies are traditionally depleted from months of cold and stored food. The horses knew this already. They moved through the pastures like four-footed herbalists, selecting what they wanted and leaving what they didn't. Their bodies began to drop their winter dullness and aches. The horses glowed. I started reconsidering my plans for a tidy lawn and continuously mowed fields. My gut had been saying no to herbicides, no matter how determined I was to maintain the ideal of a socially acceptable landscape. I started questioning how much the fields truly needed to be corrected. Anyone who manages horses knows that lush green grass can become dangerous to their metabolic systems. Modern pasture grasses are bred to grow quickly and store large amounts of sugar. Those sugars can trigger laminitis, a painful and sometimes catastrophic inflammatory condition in the horse's hooves. We spend a lot of time worrying about grass. Standing in the pasture, watching the horses snack their way through what I had been calling weeds, I began to wonder if the fields and the horses knew something that I didn't, or something that my body had forgotten. Maybe those early plants weren't intruders after all. Maybe they were the land's way of offering vitamins and easily digestible nutrients that horses and our bodies need this time of year. Maybe the best thing we could do was let the spring weeds run their course. As all the weeds were sprouting, I had a conversation with someone who had been following my story peripherally this past year. They listed all the weird, strange turns that my life had taken, the characters who blew through the farm and wreaked havoc. At this point, I wish most of it were just a product of my overactive imagination, but the crazy things this past year has brought into my life are stranger than fiction. Just when we started to find a good, peaceful stride, something arrived to shake things up. My first impulse was to say, let's pretend all this didn't happen. But hiding has never digested my lessons. I wouldn't be who I am, and the farm wouldn't be where it is, healthier, happier, and more at peace, without the big, the small, the random, and the self-fulfilling disruptions that have found us. We're sold on the belief that a good life is a smooth road without roadblocks or speed bumps. We're shamed into believing that problems, big and small, mean that we're doing it wrong. And it becomes very easy to become complacent and depressed, stuck in the status quo, when hurdles are assigned fault and treated as something to avoid rather than pushed through. Horses are smart. In the wild, they'll go around an obstacle rather than leaping over. They jump fences for humans, sometimes for fun, but mostly because it's the job we've assigned to them. But it's one thing to take the path of least resistance with the goal of conserving energy, and another to avoid all experiences for fear of being exposed. What if our problems were the whole point? Once I started paying attention to what the land was saying, it became impossible to ignore how often nature uses disruption to create renewal. One of the most dramatic examples is fire. Fire and renewal. In western forests dominated by lodgepole pine, the pine cones are sealed shut with resin. Those cones hang on the branches for years without releasing their seeds. They remain closed through wind, rain, snow, and seasons of ordinary weather. They only open when exposed to the intense heat of wildfire. When fire moves through the forest, the temperature becomes high enough to melt the resin that has sealed those cones for years. In a matter of hours, thousands of seeds are released onto the ground below. At the same time, the blaze clears away dense undergrowth that has blocked sunlight from reaching the forest floor. What was once crowded and stagnant is suddenly opened up. The fire also transforms what it touches. Branches, leaves, and fallen trees are reduced to ash, and that ash becomes a layer of minerals returned directly to the soil. Phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and other nutrients that have been locked up in the woody debris are suddenly available again to the next generation of plants. Within a season or two, the charred ground erupts with life. Pine seedlings appear by the thousands. Wildflowers, fireweed, lupine, and countless others push up through the blackened soil. Insects return first, then birds, then the slow rebuilding of the forest itself. In the case of the lodgepole pine, destruction is not separate from renewal. Fire is the mechanism that allows the next generation of the forest to begin. The fire does not interrupt the life of the forest, it activates it. At the same time, this truth does not make the experience of fire any less frightening when it's happening close to home. Back on the East Coast, a forest fire is currently raging in Georgia, fueled by the fallen trees Hurricane Helene left scattered across the landscape. And in the mountains closer to me, the woods burned for weeks in the months after the storm, the dry remnants of broken forests becoming tinder waiting for a spark. When you study your place long enough, you start to understand how closely the elements are braided together. Wind throws down the trees, water swells the rivers, fire follows the debris that's left behind. I'm speaking generally about the way life emerges after disruption in my words to you this week, but I want to say clearly that these observations don't come from a place of distance or abstraction. When the elements move through a community, the consequences are real. Homes are lost, people are injured or worse, and animals are displaced. People look around them trying to understand what has just happened to the places they love. My heart is filled with love for anyone in my community who is living in the aftermath of a disaster or who will face one in the future. Because the truth is, we are never fully in control of the systems we inhabit. We are participants in the bigger cycles, and that means we can't forget something both humbling and ancient about life on this planet. We are, all of us, at the mercy of the elements. Stable Roots is where I write each week about the intersection of land, horses, and the strange ways life teaches us through disruption and renewal. Free subscriptions bring those essays directly to your inbox, and paid subscribers help sustain the work happening here at the farm. However you choose to join me, I'm just glad that you're here. Floodplains and fertility. Flooding quickly brings change and destruction. Water spills across fields, rearranges soil, and temporarily makes the land unusable. In the hills where I live, we see the aftermath in every corner of the landscape. When Hurricane Helene came through this region, rivers climbed out of their banks and spread across valleys that had felt stable for generations. Roads disappeared, fence lines twisted, and whole sections of land were reshaped in the space of a few hours. When water moves with force, it leaves behind a broken landscape. And yet, over longer stretches of time, those same floods are the reasons many valleys become places where people can farm at all. Floodplains are some of the most fertile agricultural regions on Earth, precisely because of these disruptions. As rivers swell and spill over their banks, they carry sediment rich with minerals and organic matter from upstream. Silt from mountain soils, fragments of plants, and nutrients carried from miles away are all suspended in the water as it moves. When the floodwaters recede, those nutrients settle across the land in a thin layer. Chaos smooths into a redistribution of fertility. Depleted fields are replenished as the topsoil deepens and crops grow more vigorously in the years that follow. Entire civilizations learn to build their lives around this rhythm. The Nile flooded and receded each year, laying down the dark soil that fed Egypt for thousands of years. The Mississippi has been reshaping its floodplain for millennia, creating some of the richest farmland in North America. Even in these Appalachian foothills, the valleys that now hold our pastures and fields were shaped by countless cycles of water rising and falling long before any fence post was driven into the ground. Without flooding, the soil gradually exhausts itself. Nutrients are lost with every harvest and with every rainfall. The land grows thinner year by year, slowly losing the capacity to support life. But flooding also reminds us of something else. When the balance of the land has been disrupted, water is often the first force to reveal it. Christopher's family is from Hawaii, and this past week I've been following the Kona storms closely. Much of the Big Island has been dealing with severe flooding, but one place stood out in the reports. The 642 acres of the Mahakona Cultural and Ecological Refuge have experienced remarkably little damage. The refuge is being restored through native Hawaiian stewardship practices that work with the natural rhythms of the landscape rather than trying to impose control over them. Attention is given to erosion, seasonal rains, and the steady movement of tides. The land is allowed to follow its cycles again, free of development. Knowledge passed down through generations understands that weather is not an anomaly, but a force to live with and prepare for. In places where that wisdom still guides the work, resilience is not some shocking surprise. It is built into the relationship between people and the land from the beginning. The disturbance that appears destructive is often the very process that keeps the land alive. That truth can be hard to see when the water is still standing in the fields and people are counting what has been lost. Disruption rarely looks like renewal while it's happening. But over time, the land reveals a longer memory than our immediate fear. What feels like devastation in the moment is often part of a cycle that has sustained life far longer than we have been here to witness it. Grazing and regrowth. For a long time, people believed grazing animals were hard on the land. Remove the animals, the thinking went, and the grass would finally have a chance to grow undisturbed. Fields would become lush again if only horses, cattle, and bison stopped cropping them down. But grasslands did not evolve in the absence of grazing. They evolved because of it. For thousands of years, vast herds of animals moved across open landscapes. Bison sweeping through the prairies, antelope following the seasons, horses traveling in bands across plains and valleys. The grasses we see today developed alongside that constant pressure. Their growth patterns, their root systems, even their capacity to regenerate were shaped by being eaten. When a horse lowers its head and grazes, it's not just removing part of the plant. The act of cropping the grass triggers a biological response. The plant shifts energy downward, strengthening its roots and sending up new shoots. Hooves press seeds into the soil where they can take hold. Manure and urine return nutrients to the ground. Old plant material is broken apart and incorporated back into the living system. But it's also true that modern pastures, with their limited sizes, must be managed to protect against overgrazing. But the landscape was never meant to be contained. Like us, it's programmed for movement, pressure, rest, and regrowth. Without that cycle, grasslands begin to stall. Dead plant matter accumulates, shading out new growth, and nutrients remain locked in old stems rather than being returned to the soil. Diversity slowly fades as fewer species can compete. The healthiest landscapes are rarely the ones left untouched. Instead, they are the ones in which life constantly moves through the systems, grazing, trampling, fertilizing, resting, each action feeding the next stage of growth. Standing in the pastures this spring, watching the horses move through the fields, I recognize that pattern unfolding in front of me. Their heads drift through the henbit and chickweed, through dandelion greens and wild onions, selecting what their bodies need and leaving what their bodies do not. Every few steps, a hoof presses into the soft ground, and mouthfuls trim the plants back, inviting new growth. What I labeled nuisance weeds are part of a conversation already underway between the animals and the land. The fields are not failing, they are healing, and so am I. After centuries of mowing, fertilizing, and cultivation, the land is beginning to express what it knows how to do when given a brief pause from our constant corrections. The plants are returning in waves, each species arriving with its own purpose, each one part of a sequence that has been unfolding long before property lines were drawn around it. And maybe the wisest thing we can do is also the hardest things for humans to accept. Step back and allow the cycles to unfold. What if we trusted that the rhythms of the natural world, which are older and more patient than our management plans, often know exactly what is needed for life to begin again? Wind and renewal. The fourth element is harder to see until it's left its mark. Air is a force to be reckoned with, but we usually ignore it as it moves quietly across the landscape, invisible unless it is strong enough to bend the grasses or scatter the leaves across a field. We notice the wind when it gusts, damaging the structures and landscape around us. Wind is one of the great architects of life. Many plants depend entirely on air to reproduce and spread. Dandelion seeds drift on delicate parachutes designed to travel miles before landing. Maple trees release their spinning samaras, those little helicopter seeds children love to throw in the air, so that they can ride the currents away from the parent tree. Prairie grasses release clouds of pollen that move across vast distances, allowing plants to exchange genetic material with neighbors they will never touch. The forests rely on wind to shape them. Storms thin dense canopies by toppling weaker trees, allowing sunlight to reach the forest floor. Entire ecosystems reset in the spaces where wind has opened the sky. Scientists studying prairie ecosystems have found that wind disturbances strengthens plant communities. Constant movement forces grasses to grow deeper root systems so that they can hold their ground. Those roots stabilize soil, retain water, and store carbon underground. What looks like plants being battered by the wind is often the very process that makes them resilient. Wind moves the seeds, wind reshapes the forest, wind encourages roots to grow deeper. The same invisible currents that knock things down are often what carry life somewhere new. When Hurricane Helene came through these hills, it was the wind that set the chain reaction in motion. Trees that had stood for decades snapped and fell across the mountains. Their fallen trunks later became fuel for the fires that burned for weeks. Wind, water, and flame moved through the same story, and each element left its mark. The elements do not work alone. They move together. The elements. I know so many of you have had your lives turned upside down by natural disasters. Please know that I'm not making light of your misfortunes or trying to find optimism in them. It's just that when I began paying attention to the weeds in the field this spring, I thought I was studying plants, but accidentally discovered the way my own life has responded to disruption. I like to find meaning in symbols and lessons in patterns. Flooding redistributes nutrients, allowing soil to renew itself. Wind carries seeds and reshapes the canopy, allowing sunlight to reach the ground. Animals graze the land, and the grasses grow back stronger. The elements do not avoid disturbances. They use destruction to their advantage. Damage becomes a much longer cycle of renewal unfolding beneath the surface. Once I started seeing those patterns in the natural world, it became impossible not to recognize them in my life. This weekend, Christopher and I went out to dinner with a group of friends who have been chosen family to me most of my life. I'm hugging you hard, Tammy Turner, Christopher, and Michael. We sat around a circular table and shared bites from each dish. We shared stories and we laughed. I was blanketed in the comfort of people who have known the whole arc of my life and have continuously shown up with love. The people I've listed above have battled unbelievable odds, one fighting deeply for their life. Their stories aren't mine to tell, but my witness to the events in their lives that would bring lesser people down is an honor I will never take for granted. Sometime during the evening, Christopher mentioned that this was the first time we had gathered in a restaurant together since before he and I were married. 1 week after the ceremony, Hurricane Helene arrived. The weeks that followed became a kind of trial by fire. The storm tore through the mountains, and the farm began absorbing one disruption after another. The ground beneath our lives shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. Looking back at the past year, the list of strange turns and unexpected challenges almost feels impossible to explain to someone who didn't live through them with us. Every time we seemed to find our footing, something new arrived to shake the ground again, stranger than fiction. But sitting at that dinner table, surrounded by people who had witnessed it all and lived through even more, I realized the same patterns of destruction and renewal I saw in the land were also at work in our lives. Fire clears, flood replenishes, wind scatters seeds, grazing renews the ground, and disruption makes space for the next chapter. Every disaster I have lived through, every storm, every loss, every moment when something ended, has rearranged the landscape of my life. And over time, something stronger grows in the spaces that were left behind. The farm is healthier, the horses are thriving, my life is fuller than I could have ever imagined, even amid so many changes occurring at once. That doesn't mean the storms are easy when they arrive, but the land has been reminding me that the elements know what they're doing. Renewal often begins with disruption. In the aftermath, the weeds crop up, and eventually, if left to soak up the ground, the blooms open. When I am patient enough to watch what grows after disturbance, I begin to see that what I thought was a problem was often the beginning of something new. Love, Kim.